Sarah Mitchell walked into Mante Auto Sales on a sunny Saturday morning in April 2019, excited about finally buying her dream car. She'd saved for 3 years, working double shifts as a nurse, skipping vacations, cutting every expense she could. Now she had $8,000 for a down payment on a used Honda CR-V she'd seen on Chuck Mante's lot. Chuck greeted him with his characteristic smile and firm handshake. Everyone in Mooresville knew Chuck. He had owned this car dealership for over 20 years. He sponsored Little League teams. He was active at First Baptist Church. His face was on billboards all over town. Mante Auto Sales, your trusted local car dealer. "Sarah? It's so good to see you," Chuck said warmly. "You're here for the CR-V, right? It's a great car. One owner, low mileage, runs like a dream. Let's take it for a test drive today." Sarah test drove the car. It was perfect. Clean, reliable, just what she needed. Chuck checked her credit, got financing approved, and Sarah handed over an $8,000 bank check as a down payment. "You'll have your car in 2 weeks," Chuck guaranteed. "We just need to take care of the paperwork with the DMV, transfer the title, and then everything will be done." "I'll call you when it's ready." Sarah flew out of the dealership. She had finally done it. Her first nice car, the reward for years of hard work and sacrifice. 2 weeks passed. Chuck didn't call. Sarah called the dealership. "There's a small delay at the DMV," Chuck said. "You know how slow they are." "It'll be ready next week, another week. Still nothing." Sarah drove to the dealership. The CR-V was gone from the lot. "Oh, we moved it to our detail shop," Chuck explained smoothly. "Getting it detailed for you. Almost ready. But it wasn't ready the next week, or the week after that." Sarah kept calling. Chuck kept making excuses. Title got held up. "Paperwork issue. Should be any day now." 3 months after giving Chuck her $8,000, Sarah still didn't have her car. She drove to the dealership again, this time angry and scared. What if something was wrong? What if she'd been scammed? Chuck wasn't there. His secretary said he was at an auction. Sarah demanded her money back if they couldn't deliver the car. The secretary promised to have Chuck call her. He never did. Sarah called the police. What Sarah didn't know, what nobody in Mooresville knew yet, was that Chuck Mante had been running a massive fraud for 15 years. He'd stolen over $15 million from hundreds of customers, multiple banks, and countless lenders. The CR-V Sarah thought she was buying? Chuck had already sold it to someone else. Her $8,000 deposit, gone, spent on covering other frauds and funding Chuck's gambling addiction. Sarah Mitchell wasn't Chuck's victim. She was one of hundreds. And when the full scope of his scheme finally came to light in 2020, it would devastate an entire town that had trusted him completely. This is the story of how a small-town car dealer betrayed everyone who knew him. Let's rewind to the beginning. Mooresville, North Carolina in the 1990s. Chuck Mante opened his used car dealership in 1995. He was 33 years old, a local guy who'd worked at various dealerships around Charlotte before deciding to start his own business. He leased a lot on Main Street, bought a small inventory of used cars, and hung out his sign, Mante Auto Sales. In the beginning, it was legitimate. Chuck was actually a pretty good car dealer. He understood the business. He knew how to buy vehicles at auction, fix them up, and sell them at a profit. He was friendly, personable, knew how to close a deal without being pushy. People liked him. Mooresville was a perfect market for a small, used car dealership. It's a working-class town about 30 miles north of Charlotte, known as the Race City, USA, because so many NASCAR teams have headquarters there. People in Mooresville love cars, trucks, muscle cars, racing vehicles. Chuck positioned himself as the local guy who understood car culture, who wouldn't rip you off like those big corporate dealerships in Charlotte. The business grew steadily through the late 1990s and early 2000s. Chuck expanded his lot, increased his inventory, hired a few salespeople. He joined the Rotary Club, became active in his church, sponsored youth baseball teams. His face became synonymous with honest, small-town business values. But behind the scenes, Chuck had a problem, a gambling problem. It started with trips to Cherokee, North Carolina, where the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians operated Harrah's Cherokee Casino. Chuck would drive 2 hours into the mountains, tell his wife he was at an auto auction, and spend the evening at blackjack tables or slot machines. At first, it was just entertainment, a few $100s here and there, but gambling addiction doesn't stay small. Within a couple years, Chuck was going to Cherokee twice a week. Then he discovered online poker and sports betting. That benefit of the doubt allowed the fraud to continue for 15 years. By 2015, 10 years into his fraud, Chuck had stolen approximately $8 million. From customers, from lenders, from banks. He'd sold hundreds of vehicles without proper titles. He'd taken deposits on cars he never delivered. He'd forged countless documents. The money all went to the same place, casinos and gambling websites. Chuck's addiction had completely consumed him. He wasn't stealing to live lavishly. He drove a modest truck, lived in a middle-class house, didn't take expensive vacations. He was stealing to gamble. He'd sit in his dealership office late at night, playing online poker, watching thousands of dollars disappear into the digital void. Then he'd wake up the next morning, put on his friendly car dealer smile, and sell another car he didn't own to cover yesterday's losses. His employees started noticing strange things. Marcus Williams, Chuck's longtime mechanic, saw the same vehicles appear and disappear from the lot multiple times. Cars that were supposedly sold would reappear weeks later. New customers would come looking for cars that were already gone. Title work was always delayed, always complicated. Marcus asked Chuck about it once. "Hey boss, I keep seeing this Camaro. Thought you sold it last month?" Chuck laughed it off. "Customer backed out of the deal. We got it back. Happens all the time." But it kept happening. Too often. Marcus started documenting what he saw. License plates, VINs, customers asking about missing titles. Something was very wrong. In early 2019, Marcus's suspicions were confirmed. A customer came to the shop furious because the car they'd bought from Chuck 6 months ago had just been repossessed by a bank. The bank said Chuck had never paid off the floor plan loan. The customer had made 6 months of car payments, and now the bank was taking the vehicle because legally the bank still owned it. Marcus realized the entire dealership was probably fraudulent. How many other customers were driving cars with clouded titles? How many had paid for vehicles they didn't actually own? How much money had Chuck stolen? Marcus faced a choice: stay quiet and keep his job, or report his boss to the authorities and blow up the entire operation. He chose the truth. In August 2019, Marcus Williams walked into the Mooresville Police Department and told Detective Robert Hayes everything he'd observed over the past 5 years. Detective Hayes started digging. What he found was staggering. The police investigation took months. Detectives subpoenaed records from floor plan lenders, banks, the DMV. They interviewed dozens of customers. They audited every vehicle transaction at Mante Auto Sales going back 10 years. The numbers were worse than anyone imagined. Chuck Mante had stolen approximately $15 million over 15 years. He'd defrauded 340-plus customers who paid for cars they never received or received with fraudulent titles. 7 floor plan finance companies owed $4.3 million in unpaid vehicle loans. 4 banks defrauded through fake documentation and loan schemes. Dozens of consignment owners whose vehicles were sold without permission. The mechanics of the fraud were complex and brazen. Floor plan. Fraud. Chuck owed $4.3 million to lenders for vehicles he'd sold but never paid off. He'd been running a Ponzi-style scheme for years, using new sales to cover old debts. Title fraud. Over 200 vehicles sold with fraudulent or missing titles. Some cars were sold to multiple buyers. Others were sold while still owned by banks or previous owners. Customer deposits: $2.1 million in customer deposits for vehicles never delivered. People like Sarah Mitchell, who gave Chuck money and never got their cars. Consignment fraud: $1.8 million in vehicles consigned to Chuck for sale, which he sold and kept the money rather than paying the owners. Bank fraud: multiple fraudulent loan applications and forged documents to obtain financing. Every category of auto fraud imaginable, Chuck had committed, and he'd been doing it for 15 years while maintaining his reputation as a trustworthy hometown dealer. On February 12, 2020, Mooresville police arrested Kevin Charles Chuck Mantei at his dealership. The charges: 47 counts of obtaining property by false pretenses, 23 counts of financial transaction card fraud, 15 counts of wire fraud, and 8 counts of bank fraud. Chuck's bail was set at $1 million. He couldn't make it. The man who'd handled millions in car sales over the years had nothing left. Everything had been gambled away. As police led Chuck out of his dealership in handcuffs, customers who'd been waiting for their cars watched in shock. One woman started crying. She'd given Chuck $12,000 3 months earlier for a minivan she still hadn't received. Another man shouted angrily. His truck had been repossessed because Chuck never paid off the loan. The trusted hometown dealer was a fraud. Another victim, Michael Torres, had saved for 2 years to buy a used Jeep Wrangler from Chuck's lot. He paid $18,000, $8,000 down payment and a loan for the rest. He'd been making payments for 8 months when the Jeep was repossessed. Chuck had never paid off the floor plan loan, so the finance company still legally owned it. Michael lost his $8,000 down payment, still owed money on his loan, and no longer had a vehicle. He was a construction worker who needed a truck for his job. Without transportation, he couldn't work. Chuck's fraud didn't just cost Michael money, it cost him his livelihood. The stories multiplied. Single mothers who'd scraped together down payments for reliable cars to get to work. Young people buying their first vehicles. Families who'd trusted Chuck with their trade-ins. Retirees on fixed incomes who'd lost their life savings. All betrayed by a man they'd trusted. Detective Robert Hayes and his team worked 12-hour days documenting every fraudulent transaction. The scale was overwhelming. In just the previous 5 years, Chuck had defrauded over 200 people. Going back 15 years, the victim count exceeded 340. "I've investigated a lot of fraud cases," Detective Hayes said in a press conference, "but I've never seen anything like this. The systematic nature of it, the duration, the number of victims, and all in a small town where everyone knows everyone, Chuck Mantei betrayed an entire community." While Chuck sat in jail, unable to make bail, prosecutors built their case. District Attorney Patricia Warren knew this would be one of the biggest fraud prosecutions in county history. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, title documents, customer testimonies, floor plan lender statements. Chuck was guilty beyond any doubt. But there was a complication. Many of the victims didn't just want Chuck punished. They wanted their money back. And there was no money to recover. A forensic accountant hired by prosecutors traced where the $15 million had gone. The findings were depressing. Approximately $13.8 million had been gambled away at casinos and online betting sites. The rest went to living expenses, dealership operations, and paying off previous frauds in the Ponzi-style scheme Chuck was running. Chuck owned almost nothing of value. His house had 2 mortgages against it and was worth less than what he owed. His dealership had no real assets. The vehicles on the lot all had liens against them from floor plan lenders. His personal vehicles were financed. His bank accounts were empty. The forensic accountant estimated that victims would recover maybe 5 cents on the dollar through asset seizure. This reality devastated victims even more. Not only had they been defrauded, but they'd never get their money back. Chuck had gambled it all away. Sarah Mitchell broke down when she learned this. "I saved for 3 years," she sobbed to a victim's advocate. "I worked double shifts. I skipped Christmas presents for my kids so I could save that money, and Chuck just gambled it away? All those hours I worked, all that sacrifice, and it's just gone? Forever?" The psychological damage extended beyond the financial losses. People felt stupid for trusting Chuck. They felt ashamed for not seeing the warning signs. They questioned their own judgment. If they could be fooled by someone they'd known for years, how could they trust anyone? The sense of betrayal was particularly acute because Chuck had used his community connections to perpetrate the fraud. He'd been at church with these people. He'd coached their kids in baseball. He'd attended the same town events, the same fundraisers, the same 4th of July parades. Every friendly handshake, every warm smile, every "how's the family doing?" all of it had been part of the con. Jennifer Baker, a teacher who'd lost $9,000 in a down payment for a minivan she never received, expressed what many victims felt. "I see people I know at the grocery store now, and I wonder, do they think I'm stupid? Do they know I got scammed by Chuck? I feel like I have a sign on my forehead that says, 'Gullible Idiot.' And the worst part is, half of them probably got scammed too, and we're all just too embarrassed to admit it." Chuck's family imploded. His wife, Rachel, filed for divorce within a month of his arrest. For 25 years, she'd thought she was married to an honest businessman. She'd had no idea about the gambling addiction or the fraud. The man she thought she knew didn't exist. "I don't know who I was married to," Rachel told her attorney. "The Chuck I knew was a good husband, a good father, a good member of the community. But that was all a lie. He was living a double life and I never saw it." How do you process that? Chuck's 2 children, both in their 20s, were devastated. Their father, the man who'd taught them to ride bikes, who'd attended every school event, who'd seemed like a normal, victim after victim, took the stand. Sarah Mitchell described giving Chuck $8,000 and never receiving her car. The elderly Hendersons explained losing both their vehicles. Michael Torres testified about losing his job because his Jeep was repossessed. A young couple talked about planning to start a family and losing the minivan they'd bought for their growing family. Each testimony was heartbreaking. Each one showed a real person whose life had been damaged by Chuck's fraud. The jury watched, taking notes, their faces growing harder as the stories accumulated. Chuck's defense attorney tried to paint this as a gambling addiction that spiraled out of control. "My client is sick," the attorney argued. "He has a disease, gambling disorder. He made terrible choices driven by that addiction. But this isn't a case of a mastermind criminal. This is a sick man who needs treatment, not decades in prison." It was a weak defense, and everyone knew it. Yes, Chuck had a gambling addiction. But that didn't excuse stealing $15 million. Lots of people have addictions. They don't all commit massive fraud. Prosecutors demolished the addiction defense. "Gambling addiction might explain why Chuck needed money," the prosecutor said in closing arguments. "It doesn't explain the elaborate schemes he created to steal it. It doesn't explain forging documents, lying to customers for months, selling the same car multiple times. Those weren't impulsive acts of an addict. Those were calculated crimes by a con artist." The prosecutor continued. Chuck Mantei spent 15 years systematically stealing from people who trusted him. He looked them in the eye, shook their hands, took their money, and lied. He lied to single mothers trying to get to work. He lied to elderly people on fixed incomes. He lied to young families just starting out. And when they came back asking for their cars or their money, he lied some more. That's not addiction. That's choosing to be a thief. Chuck took the stand in his own defense. Another mistake. Under cross-examination, he fell apart. He couldn't explain the forged documents. He couldn't justify selling cars multiple times. He couldn't account for where all the money went. "Mr. Monte," the prosecutor asked, "did you know it was illegal to sell cars you didn't own?" "Well, yes, but I intended to pay off the loans eventually." "But you didn't pay them off, did you? You sold the cars, took the money, and gambled it away." "I had a problem. I couldn't control it." Couldn't control gambling? Or couldn't control stealing? Chuck had no good answer. He'd stolen because he wanted to gamble, and he'd kept stealing to cover up the previous thefts. There was no explanation that made it acceptable. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all 93 criminal counts. Chuck sat motionless as the verdicts were read. Guilty, guilty, guilty. 93 times the word echoed through the courtroom. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder, but Chuck didn't react. The reality was finally sinking in. He'd destroyed his life, his family, and hundreds of other lives. And now he'd spend the rest of his life in prison. Sentencing was scheduled for December 2020. The judge allowed victim impact statements. Over 40 people registered to speak. The hearing lasted 2 full days. One by one, Chuck's victims stood before the court and described the harm he'd caused. The financial devastation, the broken trust, the lasting psychological damage. Marcus Williams, the mechanic who'd blown the whistle, spoke about his guilt for not acting sooner. "I saw things that didn't make sense for years," Marcus said, his voice heavy. "I should have reported it earlier. Maybe I could have stopped him before he hurt so many people. I'll carry that guilt forever." Sarah Mitchell talked about working double shifts as a nurse during a pandemic, risking her health to save money, only to have Chuck steal it. "Every COVID patient I took care of, every extra shift I worked, I was doing that to save for my car. And Chuck just gambled it away like it was nothing. That money represented hours of my life. Hours I'll never get back. Hours that Chuck stole from me." The elderly Hendersons, now both over 70 and without vehicles, struggled through their testimony. "We're too old to recover from this," James Henderson said, his wife crying beside him. "We lost everything. Our truck, our car, our savings. At our age, you can't start over. Chuck stole our retirement. He stole our dignity. We feel foolish for trusting him. We feel angry that someone we knew could do this to us. But mostly we just feel broken." A young mother named Lisa Garcia testified about buying a minivan to transport her 3 kids. Chuck had taken her $7,000 down payment. She never got the van, never got her money back, and was now struggling to get her kids to school and activities. "My children," just about the financial losses, though those were devastating. It was about the psychological impact of learning that someone you'd known and trusted for decades had been systematically stealing from you. Sarah Mitchell, the nurse who'd lost $8,000 on the Honda CR-V that never materialized, eventually received $417 through the restitution process. 5% of what Chuck stole from her. She'd saved for 3 years for that car, working double shifts during a pandemic. She got back less than what she'd earn in 2 weeks. "The money is gone," Sarah said in 2021. "I've accepted that. But what I can't accept is how stupid I feel. I'm a smart person. I'm an educated professional. How did I let someone con me so easily? Every time I see a car dealership now, I feel anxious. I don't trust salespeople. I don't trust friendly people who seem helpful. Chuck broke something in me that I don't know how to fix." That sense of broken trust was universal among Chuck's victims. The fraud didn't just cost them money. It cost them the ability to believe people were fundamentally good. It made them cynical, suspicious, and fearful of being fooled again. The elderly Hendersons, who'd lost both their vehicles and their $6,000 trade-in value, faced even worse consequences. At 73 and 71 years old, they couldn't afford to buy new cars. Their adult children pooled money to buy them an old used car, but it wasn't reliable. James Henderson had to give up his volunteer work at the local library because he couldn't guarantee transportation. Martha stopped attending her quilting group because she felt ashamed of their situation. "We worked our whole lives," James said. "We did everything right. We saved, we paid our bills, we were responsible. And one person's greed destroyed decades of hard work. At our age, there's no recovering. This is how we'll spend our final years, struggling, worrying, feeling foolish for trusting someone." Michael Torres, the construction worker whose Jeep was repossessed because Chuck never paid off the floor plan loan, lost his job because he couldn't get to work sites. It took him 8 months to find another job and save enough for a different vehicle. By then, he'd lost his apartment, moved in with his parents, and watched his credit score plummet because he still owed money on the car loan for a vehicle he no longer possessed. "Chuck didn't just steal my money," Michael said. "He stole my momentum. I was building a career, saving for a house, planning a future. His fraud set me back years. I'm 35 years old, living with my parents, starting over. All because some guy wanted to gamble." Monte Auto Sales closed permanently in March 2020. The dealership lot, which had been a fixture on Main Street for 25 years, sat empty for over a year. Nobody wanted to lease the space. It was tainted by Chuck's fraud. Eventually, a restaurant chain bought the property, demolished the building, and built a casual dining establishment. The site where hundreds of people had been defrauded now serves burgers and fries to families who try not to think about what used to be there. Marcus Williams, the mechanic who'd blown the whistle on Chuck, struggled with his decision. On one hand, he'd done the right thing by reporting the fraud. On the other hand, he felt guilty for not acting sooner. "I saw weird stuff for 5 years before I reported it," Marcus told a support group for fraud whistleblowers. "Cars appearing and disappearing. Customers asking about titles. Strange transactions. I suspected something was wrong, but I didn't want to believe it. I needed the job. I didn't want to cause trouble. So I stayed quiet. And during those 5 years, how many more people did Chuck scam? That's on me." A therapist helped Marcus understand that Chuck's fraud wasn't his fault. Marcus was a victim too. Chuck had lied to his employees just as he'd lied to his customers. But the guilt lingered. Marcus eventually moved to a different town, unable to face the victims who wondered why he hadn't reported the fraud earlier. The financial recovery process was brutal and disappointing. When Chuck was sentenced, the court ordered $15 million in restitution. But Chuck had no money. The forensic accountants found approximately $750,000 in seizable assets. Chuck's house, after paying off mortgages, $82,000. Dealership equipment and property, $215,000. Personal vehicles and belongings, $38,000. Bank accounts and investments, $11,000. Insurance claims, $404,000. Total, $750,000 to distribute among victims owed $15 million. That meant victims would recover about 5 cents on the dollar, assuming the distribution process didn't eat up more in legal fees. Several floor plan finance companies filed lawsuits trying to claim priority on the assets, arguing they were secured creditors. Customer victims argued they should be first in line because they were individuals who couldn't absorb the losses like corporations could. The legal battles took over a year and consumed hundreds of thousands in attorney fees. Eventually, a settlement was reached. Individual customer victims would receive approximately 7% of their losses. Floor plan lenders would receive about 3%. Everyone would lose money. But at least the legal fighting could end and people could move forward. Sarah Mitchell received $560 from the restitution fund. Not the $417 she'd initially calculated, but still far less than her $8,000 loss. She used the money to buy a cheap used bicycle so she could get to work when her old car finally died. The Hendersons received $420. They laughed bitterly when the check arrived. $420 for losing everything, James said. I guess that's what our trust was worth. Michael Torres got $1,260. It didn't cover even half of what he'd lost, and it came 3 years after the fraud. 3 years too late to help when he'd lost his job and his apartment. The broader impact on Mooresville's business community was significant. Other car dealerships in the area saw sales drop as people became suspicious of all car dealers. We're legitimate businesses, said Tom Bradley, owner of Bradley Auto Group in neighboring Cornelius. But after what Chuck did, people assume all car dealers are crooks. We've had to implement new transparency measures, offer third-party inspections, provide extra documentation, all to prove we're not like Chuck Mantei. His fraud hurt everyone in this industry. Banks became more cautious about floor plan financing. Some small dealerships couldn't get financing anymore because lenders were spooked by what had happened with Chuck. The tighter credit meant fewer used car lots, which meant less competition, which meant higher prices for consumers. Chuck's fraud created ripple effects throughout the regional auto market. The town itself struggled with its reputation. Mooresville had always prided itself on being a tight-knit community where people looked out for each other. The Chuck Mantei scandal exposed that small-town trust could be exploited. People became more guarded, less willing to give neighbors the benefit of the doubt, more suspicious of friendly local business people. Jennifer Baker, the teacher who'd lost $9,000, moved to a different town because she couldn't stand seeing the Mantei auto sales property every day on her commute. Every time I drove past that lot, I felt sick, she said. It reminded me of my own stupidity. I had to leave Mooresville to escape that feeling. Several victims attended therapy to deal with the psychological trauma. Support groups formed for people who'd been defrauded by Chuck. They'd meet monthly, share their stories, and try to process the betrayal together. The meetings helped some people. Others found them too painful. Hearing everyone else's losses just amplified their own. As years passed, some victims found ways to move forward. Not to forget, you don't forget losing life savings, but to rebuild despite the loss. Sarah Mitchell eventually saved enough to buy a modest used car from a dealership in Charlotte. She brought a mechanic with her to inspect it, demanded full documentation, and paid a lawyer to review the paperwork before signing anything. I'll never trust like I used to, she said. But I can't let Chuck's fraud paralyze me forever. I needed a car. I found one. I just made sure to verify everything 3 times before buying. Michael Torres started his own small construction business. If I can survive what Chuck did to me, losing my job, my home, my savings, I can survive anything, he reasoned. His fraud made me more resilient. I don't recommend it as a learning experience, but I came out of it stronger. His business struggled at first, but by 2023 he was doing well enough to buy a house and start the life Chuck's fraud had delayed. Not everyone recovered as well. Some victims never financially recovered. The Hendersons still struggle. Some younger victims are still paying off car loans for vehicles they don't own anymore, their credit scores destroyed, their financial futures compromised. One victim died by suicide in 2021. David Patterson, a 47-year-old electrician, had lost $22,000 in the fraud, his entire savings. He'd been planning to use that money to start his own business. Instead, he lost everything. Friends said he spiraled into depression. Couldn't shake the feeling of being foolish for trusting Chuck. His family blamed Chuck for his death, though legally there was no connection. But they knew David's despair started with the fraud. Chuck didn't just steal money, David's sister said at a victim support meeting. He stole hope. He stole dreams. For some people, like my brother, that was too much to bear. Chuck's ex-wife, Rachel, rebuilt her life slowly. She'd been married to him for 25 years, believing she knew him completely. The discovery that her husband was living a double life, gambling, addict, and fraud, shattered her sense of reality. "I keep looking back at our marriage, trying to find the signs I missed," Rachel said in an interview in 2023. "Were there warning signs? Did I ignore red flags? Or was Chuck just that good at lying? I'll never know. What I do know is that the man I married either never existed or stopped existing at some point. I was married to a stranger for years and didn't realize it." She changed her name back to her maiden name. She moved to a different state to escape the association with Chuck. She's been in therapy for years, working through the betrayal and the guilt. Irrational guilt, her therapist says, but guilt nonetheless. Guilt for not seeing what he was doing. Guilt for enjoying a life funded partly by stolen money. Guilt for being the wife of someone who destroyed so many lives. Chuck's children, now in their 30s, have had to come to terms with having a father in prison for fraud. Both changed their last names. Both moved away from North Carolina. Neither visits Chuck in prison or responds to his letters. "He's not my father anymore," Kevin Jr. said. "My father was the man I thought I knew growing up." That man doesn't exist. The person in prison is a criminal I happen to be biologically related to. That's all. The younger generation of Mooresville, people who were teenagers when Chuck was arrested, know his name as a cautionary tale. Parents tell their kids, "Remember Chuck Mantei?" That's what happens when you think rules don't apply to you. His fraud became a local legend, a story told to teach lessons about trust, greed, and consequences. The North Carolina legislature passed new regulations in response to Chuck's fraud. The Mantei Act, though that's not its official name, required more stringent oversight of used car dealerships. Floor plan lenders must verify inventory monthly rather than quarterly. Dealers must provide customers with documentation showing liens are paid off before transferring titles. The DM5 implemented new tracking systems to flag vehicles sold multiple times or with unresolved title issues. These changes came too late for Chuck's victims, but they would protect future customers. Other states looked at North Carolina's reforms and implemented similar protections. Chuck's 15-year fraud ended up driving nationwide improvements in auto dealer oversight. Law enforcement also learned lessons. Detective Robert Hayes, who led the investigation, now trains other officers on financial fraud detection. The Chuck Mantei case taught us to look beyond surface-level legitimacy. Hayes tells training classes. Chuck had been in business for decades. He seemed trustworthy. He was active in the community. All of that made people give him the benefit of the doubt. But fraud doesn't have a stereotype. It can be your neighbor, your friend, the guy at church. Trust, but verify. Always verify. What are the broader lessons from Chuck Mantei's 15-year fraud? First, community trust can be a weapon. Chuck exploited his small-town reputation ruthlessly. He used Little League sponsorships, church membership, and 20 years of business presence to create a trustworthy image. Then he used that trust to steal. The more embedded he was in the community, the easier it was to defraud people. This is the dark side of small-town closeness. When you trust everyone because everyone knows everyone, you're vulnerable to the person who abuses that trust. Second, addiction doesn't excuse crime. Chuck had a genuine gambling addiction, that's clear. But millions of people have addictions and don't commit $15 million in fraud. Addiction explains the motive. He needed money to gamble, but doesn't excuse the method, systematic theft and deception. Chuck chose to steal rather than seek help, chose to cover up rather than come clean, chose to victimize others rather than face his own problems. Third, small frauds become big frauds. Chuck didn't start out planning to steal $15 million. He started with small thefts, maybe a few $1,000s here and there. But each theft required a cover-up, which required more theft, which required more cover-ups. The Ponzi-style scheme grew because he couldn't stop without being caught. Small compromises in integrity snowball into massive crimes. Fourth, verify everything in major transactions. Chuck's victims trusted too much and verified too little. They assumed that because Chuck was established and local, he must be honest. They didn't independently verify titles, didn't confirm liens were paid off, didn't check references with other customers. When buying a car or making any major purchase, verify independently. Don't trust the seller to police themselves. Fifth, financial fraud has psychological victims. The dollars stolen are measurable. The psychological damage isn't. Chuck didn't just take money,